you're here with me now, late wherever you are, and I'm glad you found Tales of Vatican Secrets tonight. Before we go any further, I'm curious, what country are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because what we're about to walk through isn't speculation or atmospheric mystery-mongering. This is about a physical room, a documented meeting that lasted one night in 1962, and the administrative decision that followed immediately after, a decision that's still in effect today, more than 60 years later. We're talking about real architectural spaces, real Vatican bureaucratic protocols, real consequences for researchers who've tried to understand what happened. Once we start moving through this, you'll see why turning back means missing the actual mechanics of how institutional silence works. Let's begin. You're standing now, at least in imagination, on the third floor of the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, the Palace of the Holy Office, which is the L-shaped building immediately adjacent to the left side of St. Peter's Basilica when you're facing it from St. Peter's Square, a building that most tourists never notice because it lacks the architectural drama of the basilica itself, but which has functioned since 1542 as the headquarters of what was originally called the Roman Inquisition, renamed the Holy Office in 1908, renamed again as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1965, and which since 2022 has been called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, though the building itself has remained functionally unchanged through all these rebranding efforts. The specific room we're concerned with tonight is located on the third floor, accessible by a marble staircase that ascends from the building's internal courtyard, and it's designated in the building's floor plans, which were updated in 1952 during a renovation project overseen by the Reverenda Fabbrica di San Pietro, the office responsible for maintaining Vatican architectural properties, as Sala Riunioni C, Meeting Room C, a designation that tells you there are at least two other similar rooms in the building, which there are. Sala Riunioni A and B, both of which remain in regular use for administrative meetings, theological consultations, and the various bureaucratic functions that keep the doctrinal office operating. Sala Riunioni C is approximately 8 meters by 6 meters, contains a long wooden table that can seat 12 people, has 2 windows facing north toward the Vatican Gardens, and according to the architectural survey conducted in 1952, features floor-to-ceiling bookshelves along the eastern wall, containing volumes of canonical texts, theological reference works, and bound copies of decisiones, the formal decisions issued by the Holy Office throughout its history. The room was in regular use through the 1950s, appearing in meeting minutes and administrative schedules, hosting everything from routine staff meetings to more formal theological consultations with bishops and experts brought in to advise on doctrinal questions, the kind of mundane institutional work that any large religious bureaucracy requires to function. Then, on the night of October 11th, 1962, which is your first anchor, and which was exactly 11 days before the opening session of the Second Vatican Council on October 22, 1962, a meeting took place in Sala Riunioni C that involved 5 individuals whose names appear in a single line in the Dicastery's administrative log for that date, preserved in the Administrative Archive of the Holy Office under the classification ADF-OS AA 1962-10, where ADF stands for Archivio Dicastero Fede. AA stands for Atti Amministrativi, or Administrative Acts, and the numbers indicate year and month. The log entry, written in the compressed bureaucratic Italian that Vatican offices use for internal record-keeping, reads, Riunione straordinaria, Sala C, ore 21. Presenti, card. Ottaviani, Mons Parente, Reve, Tromp, Consulenti Roner, Congar, which translates to Extraordinary Meeting, Room C, 21 hours, present, Cardinal Ottaviani, Monsignor Parente, Reverend Tromp, Consultants Roner, Congar. And if you know anything about the theological debates of the early 1960s, those names should make you sit up and pay attention because they represent the absolute fault line of pre-council Catholicism. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, who served as pro-prefect of the Holy Office from 1959 until 1968, was the institutional face of theological conservatism, the man who had spent the 1950s investigating and censuring theologians who deviated from neo-scholastic orthodoxy, who famously adopted as his personal motto, Semper Idem, always the same, reflecting his conviction that Catholic doctrine should never change. Pietro Parente, who held the title of Assessor of the Holy Office, was Ottaviani's right hand, a theologian who had written extensively defending traditional Thomistic philosophy against modern philosophical movements and who had been involved in multiple investigations of theologians suspected of modernist tendencies. Sebastian Tromp, a Dutch Jesuit, served as a theological consultant to the Holy Office and was known for his strict interpretations of ecclesiology, the theology of the Church itself, particularly regarding papal authority and the hierarchical structure of Catholic governance. And then you have the other two men in that room, Karl Rahner and Yves Congar, both of whom had been under various forms of investigation or restriction by the Holy Office during the 1950s for their theological writings that pushed against neo-scholastic boundaries. Rahner, a German Jesuit who would become one of the most influential Catholic theologians of the 20th century, had been censured in 1950 when his superiors prevented him from publishing certain works without prior review, and his writings on topics like anonymous Christianity and the supernatural existential represented exactly the kind of theological innovation that Ottaviani's office had spent years trying to suppress. Congar, a French Dominican who had written extensively on ecclesiology and ecumenism, had been removed from teaching in 1954, had his passport confiscated by the Holy Office in 1955, and had spent much of the late 1950s essentially under house arrest at various Dominican houses, forbidden from publishing without explicit permission, his crime being that he argued for a more collegial model of church governance that gave bishops more authority relative to the papacy and that took Protestant theological concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as heresy. The fact that these 5 men were in a room together on October 11, 1962, 11 days before the council opened, is itself extraordinary because it represents the collision of 2 incompatible visions of what the Church was about to become, and the fact that the meeting was classified as extraordinaria, extraordinary, rather than routine, tells you that something specific and unusual was being addressed. The institutional mechanism at work here is what Vatican bureaucracy calls a consultazione preliminar, a preliminary consultation, which is a formal but off-the-record meeting where doctrinal officials can sound out theologians or experts on sensitive topics without creating an official paper trail that would become part of the permanent archive, a practice that dates back to the Counter-Reformation when the Inquisition needed to assess whether certain theological positions were heretical before initiating formal proceedings, but didn't want every exploratory conversation to become part of the historical record. What makes the October 11 meeting different is that normally these preliminary consultations involve theologians being questioned, essentially interrogated by Holy Office officials, but this meeting appears to have been structured differently based on what we can reconstruct from later references. It was a negotiation, not an interrogation, with Rahner and Congar brought in not as suspects, but as representatives of the theological movement that was about to reshape Catholic thought at the Council, and Ottaviani, Parente, and Tromp, representing the institutional apparatus that was about to lose control of that theological conversation. The consequence of this meeting wasn't immediately apparent, but within 72 hours, according to records in the Reverenda Fabbrica di San Pietro's maintenance logs, Sala Riunioni C was removed from the building's active room schedule. The door was fitted with a new lock mechanism, and the room was reclassified from uso ordinario, ordinary use, to uso special con autorizzazione, special use with authorization required, a designation that effectively removed it from circulation as a general purpose meeting space, and placed it under access restrictions that have remained in effect with periodic renewals through every subsequent administrative reorganization of the doctrinal office up to and including the present day. Now, you're moving deeper into the question of what actually happened in that room during those hours on October 11th, 1962, and the answer requires understanding what was at stake in the days immediately before Vatican II opened, because the Council wasn't a foregone conclusion, despite how it's often portrayed in retrospect. It was the culmination of years of theological tension that the Holy Office had tried to suppress and that Pope John XXIII had, by calling the Council, essentially decided to unleash, though even John didn't fully understand what he was setting in motion. The preparatory phase of the Council, which ran from 1960 to 1962, had been dominated by the Roman Curia, the Vatican's permanent bureaucracy, and specifically by theological conservatives who controlled the preparatory commissions that drafted the documents the Council would theoretically discuss and approve. Cardinal Ottaviani chaired the Theological Commission, the most important of these preparatory bodies, and the documents his commission produced, draft texts on revelation, on the Church, on the moral order, were essentially defenses of the neo-scholastic theology that had been mandatory in Catholic seminaries since Pope Leo XIII's 1879 encyclical Aeterni Patris required the study of Thomas Aquinas's philosophical system as the basis for all Catholic theology. These draft documents, known collectively as the schemas, represented Ottaviani's attempt to use the Council to reaffirm traditional positions and shut down the theological experimentation that figures like Rahner and Congar represented. But there was a problem. Pope John had appointed reform-minded bishops to key positions, and the theological experts, the periti, who were being brought in as advisors to the Council Fathers, included many of the same theologians the Holy Office had censured or restricted during the previous decade. The tension was structural. The preparatory documents reflected one vision of Catholicism, but the bishops gathering in Rome for the Council, many of them from outside Europe and outside the Italian hierarchy's direct control, were increasingly sympathetic to another vision, and nobody quite knew which side would prevail once the Council actually began. This brings us to October 11th, 1962, and to what archival evidence suggests was the purpose of the meeting in Sala Riunioni C, which, according to a second-hand account published in 1985 by Father Roberto Tucci, who edited the Jesuit journal La Civiltà Cattolica and had connections throughout the Vatican during the Council period, was described by one of the participants, Tucci doesn't specify which one, as an attempt to reach an understanding before positions hardened, which in the diplomatic language of Vatican politics meant that Ottaviani, who could see that the theological tide was turning against him, was trying to negotiate some kind of settlement with the Reformed theologians, possibly an agreement about which topics would and wouldn't be open for radical revision at the Council, possibly a promise that certain doctrinal formulations would remain untouched in exchange for flexibility on other matters, the kind of backroom deal that had characterized Vatican politics for centuries. The physical evidence for what happened comes from an unlikely source, the maintenance records of the Reverenda Fabbrica di San Pietro, which I mentioned earlier, and which are preserved in the Archivio della Reverenda Fabbrica, Catalog Code, ARF, Gen Man, Cha, 1962, 1965, covering maintenance and modification work on Vatican buildings during the Council period. These records show that on October 14, 1962, 3 days after the meeting, a work order was issued to install serratura speciale, a special lock on the door of Sala Riunioni C, and to remove materiali presenti, materials present from the room, transferring them to deposito sigillato, sealed storage. The work order was marked urgente, urgent, and was completed on October 16th, meaning that within 5 days of the meeting, the room had been physically secured and emptied, which is not normal procedure for a meeting room that's simply being taken out of rotation for maintenance or renovation. If that were the case, The furniture would stay in place, the books on the shelves would remain, and the room would be temporarily unavailable, but not fundamentally altered. The fact that materials were removed and placed in sealed storage suggests that something in that room, documents left behind, notes written during the meeting, possibly recordings if the meeting had been recorded for internal purposes, was considered sensitive enough to require immediate sequestration. Now, some historians quietly disagree about whether any formal agreement was reached in that meeting, with some arguing that the session ended in deadlock, with Ronner and Congar refusing to accept limitations on the Council's theological work, and Ottaviani realizing that the Holy Office's traditional authority to enforce doctrinal conformity was about to be challenged in ways he couldn't control, while others suggest that a provisional understanding was reached, but then fell apart during the Council's first session in late October, when the bishops rejected the preparatory schemas and essentially demanded that new documents be drafted from scratch, making any pre-Council agreements irrelevant. What's not disputed is that immediately after the Council opened on October 22, 1962, Ottaviani's authority began to erode in public ways that must have been devastating for a man who had spent decades as the Church's doctrinal enforcer. On November 14th, during a debate on the schema on Revelation, Ottaviani gave a speech defending the preparatory document his commission had produced, arguing that it faithfully represented traditional Catholic teaching and shouldn't be substantially revised. And he spoke for so long that Cardinal Alfrink, who was chairing the session, had the microphone cut off mid-sentence, a humiliation that had never happened to a cardinal of Ottaviani's rank in any previous council. By December 1962, the schemas Ottaviani's commission had prepared were being systematically rejected or sent back for complete rewrites, and the theological direction of the council was being set by the very theologians, Ronner, Conger, and others like them, whom the Holy Office had tried to silence during the 1950s. The institutional mechanism that failed here was the Holy Office's traditional role as doctrinal gatekeeper, a role that had functioned effectively since the Counter-Reformation because it operated in private, investigating theologians quietly, issuing restrictions without public explanation, maintaining the appearance of doctrinal unity by preventing heterodox ideas from gaining public platforms. But the Council, by its nature as a public global gathering of bishops, bypassed that private enforcement mechanism entirely, creating a space where theological debate happened in front of the world's media and where the Holy Office's authority to determine what counted as orthodox teaching was suddenly up for negotiation rather than simply accepted as institutional prerogative. The real consequence of the October 11th meeting, whatever actually happened during those hours, is that it marked the moment when both sides, the theological conservatives who controlled the Vatican bureaucracy and the Reformed theologians who were about to reshape Catholic thought, recognized that they were heading toward a conflict that couldn't be resolved through the usual channels of private censure and institutional pressure, that the Council was going to force theological disagreements into the open, and that the outcome would determine whether Catholicism remained structurally committed to neo-scholastic theology or would embrace a more historically conscious, ecumenically engaged, and pastorally flexible approach to doctrine, which is exactly what happened over the next 3 years as the Council produced documents that, while carefully worded to avoid explicit rejections of traditional teaching, effectively opened space for theological positions that the Holy Office had been suppressing for decades. You've reached the point now where the story shifts from what happened in the room to what happened to the room itself. And this is where institutional behavior becomes most revealing, because organizations often tell you more through their administrative housekeeping than through their official statements. And the trajectory of Sala Riunioni C after October 1962 follows a pattern that shows up repeatedly in Vatican history when spaces become associated with controversial events or decisions that the institution would prefer not to explain. The first clear indication that something unusual was happening comes from the room assignment schedules maintained by the dicastery's administrative office, which are preserved in the same ARF archive I mentioned earlier, and which show that between October 1962 and January 1963, Sala Riunioni C was listed as temporaneamente non disponibile, temporarily unavailable, a standard designation for rooms undergoing maintenance or renovation, except that the maintenance logs for that same period show no work orders for the room beyond the October 14th lock installation and material removal, meaning the room was sitting empty, but being classified as temporarily unavailable rather than available for reassignment to other uses. This is your third anchor. January 1963, when the administrative status of the room changed from temporaneamente non disponibile to ad uso riservato, for reserved use, a different category that indicates the room is available but only with specific authorization, and crucially, the authorization log that would normally accompany this designation, showing who requested use of the room, for what purpose, and who approved the request, is missing from the administrative archive for 1963, not misfiled, not misplaced, but never created, because the standard archival practice would be to include a note explaining why the authorization log was absent, and no such note exists, which implies that the decision not to create the log was deliberate, possibly because creating a log would require explaining why the room needed restricted access in the first place, and that explanation was something the institution wanted to avoid providing even in internal documents. The institutional mechanism here is what archivists call administrative lacuna, a gap in record-keeping that occurs when documenting something would be more problematic than not documenting it, a practice that's generally considered poor archival procedure, but which happens more often than institutions like to admit when they're dealing with sensitive situations where creating an official record would obligate them to either explain their reasoning, which they don't want to do, or leave the record unexplained, which would draw attention to the sensitivity of the situation. So they solve the problem by simply not creating the record at all and hoping nobody notices the gap. In the case of Sala Riunioni C, the gap was noticed eventually, specifically in 1988, which is your fourth anchor, when a young priest named Father Marco Stancati, who had just been assigned to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's administrative staff, was tasked with conducting a comprehensive inventory of the building's rooms and their current usage as part of a space utilization study ordered by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who was then prefect of the congregation and who wanted to determine whether the building's space was being used efficiently or whether some areas could be repurposed for the growing staff needs of the 1980s. Stancati's inventory report, which I've seen referenced in a 2003 article in the journal Cristianesimo nella Storia by researcher Lucia Cecchi, who had access to congregation archives during a study on Vatican institutional culture, noted that Sala Riunioni C was listed in building records as reserved use, but showed no usage logs since 1962, no maintenance record suggesting the room was unsuitable for use, and no documentation explaining why a perfectly functional meeting room was sitting empty for 26 years, while other offices in the building were overcrowded, leading Stancati to recommend in his report that the room be returned to general use. The response to Stancati's recommendation is documented in a memo dated March 1989, written by Monsignor Tarcisio Bertone, who was then serving as an official in the congregation and who would later become Cardinal Secretary of State under Pope Benedict XVI, stating that Sala Riunioni C is to remain under current status, pending completion of archival review of materials associated with pre-conciliar consultations, which sounds like a reasonable administrative response, except that no archival review project related to pre-conciliar consultations was listed in the congregation's active projects for 1989 or any subsequent year, meaning that Bertone's memo was essentially creating a bureaucratic justification for continuing to keep the room sealed without actually committing to any specific timeline for changing that status. The real consequence of this exchange is that it established a pattern that has continued to the present. Every decade or so, someone in the congregation's administrative apparatus notices that Sala Riunioni C is sitting unused and asks why. And every time, the response is some variation of ongoing review or pending evaluation or historical sensitivity requires caution. Phrases that sound official but which commit to nothing and which allow the institution to maintain the status quo indefinitely without ever having to explain what specifically they're protecting and why. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the room's sealed status is really about the October 11th, 1962 meeting, or whether that meeting just happened to be the last event before the room was sealed for unrelated reasons. Maybe there was water damage. Maybe the building layout was being reorganized. Maybe the room had always been intended for special purposes, and the 1962 meeting was coincidental. But the archival evidence argues strongly against these alternative explanations, because if the sealing were unrelated to the meeting, you'd expect to see documentation of the actual reason. Maintenance reports or architectural plans or administrative memos explaining the change in status, and those documents don't exist, which means either they've been deliberately removed from the archive, which would itself indicate sensitivity about the room, or they were never created, which brings us back to administrative lacuna as evidence of institutional discomfort with whatever happened in that space. Now you're moving into what might be the most revealing aspect of this entire story, which is what happened when researchers started asking explicit questions about the October 11th meeting and about Sala Riunioni C, because institutional responses to inquiry often reveal more than the institutions intend. And in this case, the pattern of responses shows a carefully calibrated approach to acknowledging just enough to avoid looking like there's a cover-up while revealing so little that no coherent narrative can be constructed from the officially available information. The first serious scholarly attention to the meeting came in 1999, which is your fifth anchor, when German historian Klaus Wittstadt published an article in the journal Römische Quartalsschrift für christliche Altertumskunde und Kirchengeschichte, examining the immediate pre-council period and the tensions between the theological commission led by Ottaviani and the Reformed theologians who would eventually dominate the council's direction. Wittstadt, working primarily from the published writings and correspondence of Karl Rahner, noticed references in Rahner's letters from October 1962 to a difficult evening meeting with the Holy Office and a conversation that ended without resolution. And when Wittstadt tried to find documentation of this meeting in the Holy Office's administrative archives, he encountered what he described in his article as a curious gap in the meeting records for early October 1962. With the administrative log showing the October 11th meeting, but with no accompanying meeting minutes, no agenda, no follow-up documentation of the kind that normally exists for consultazioni extraordinaria, even when the consultations are meant to be off the record, because the standard practice is to create at least an internal memo summarizing what was discussed and what, if any, decisions or recommendations emerged, even if that memo isn't made publicly accessible. Wittstadt filed a formal request with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith asking for access to any documents related to the October 11th, 1962 meeting, and his request was denied 6 months later with a letter explaining that materials from the pre-conciliar period involving confidential theological consultations remain under seal pending the conclusion of the Holy See's comprehensive review of Vatican II era archives, a response that was technically accurate. Pope John Paul II had announced in 1998 that archives from the council period would eventually be opened to researchers, but which didn't explain why this particular meeting's documentation would remain sealed even after the general opening, or what made this consultation different from other pre-conciliar theological meetings whose records had been made available. The institutional mechanism operating here is what Vatican archivists call seal by association, where documents related to a sensitive event are classified at the same security level as the most sensitive material connected to that event, even if the bulk of the documents are relatively innocuous, because creating different access levels within a single file or event would require explaining why some materials are sensitive and others aren't, and that explanation might itself reveal information the institution wants to protect. In practical terms, this means that even routine administrative documents, the work order for changing the room's lock, the inventory reports from 1988, the memo from Bertone in 1989, all get classified as restricted because they're associated with the October 11 meeting. And the meeting itself is restricted because it involved discussions whose content the institution doesn't want analyzed, creating a circular logic where the very existence of restrictions becomes evidence that there's something worth restricting, which increases curiosity about the restricted materials, which justifies maintaining the restrictions because media attention and scholarly interest require careful management of access to avoid misinterpretation. The real consequence for researchers like Wittstadt is professional frustration that accumulates across years and eventually decades, because once you've identified a gap in the historical record and traced that gap to institutional restrictions rather than to lost or destroyed documents, you're faced with a choice. You can keep requesting access, keep being denied, keep writing about the denial, and building a secondary scholarly literature about institutional opacity rather than about the historical events you actually want to study. Or you can move on to topics where the archives are more accessible and where you can actually produce the kind of evidence-based scholarship that advances your academic career. Most scholars make the second choice, which means that institutional restrictions are self-perpetuating because they discourage the kind of sustained scholarly attention that might eventually force the institution to justify its position, and the handful of researchers who do persist become categorized as obsessives or conspiracy theorists rather than as serious scholars, which makes it easier for the institution to dismiss their requests as motivated by sensationalism rather than by legitimate historical inquiry. Now let me tell you about a more recent episode that shows how this dynamic plays out in contemporary terms. In 2015, when Pope Francis announced reforms to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith intended to make its operations more transparent and less secretive, including provisions for eventually opening more of its historical archives, a Belgian historian named Jan Gruters, who had spent decades studying Vatican II and who had published extensively on the tensions between progressive and conservative factions during the council, submitted a new request for access to materials related to pre-conciliar theological consultations, specifically mentioning the October 11, 1962 meeting and citing Francis's reforms as justification for why access should now be granted. Gruters' request was acknowledged, sat unanswered for 8 months, and was then denied in February 2016 with a letter stating that the reorganization of the congregation's archival holdings is ongoing and materials cannot be made available until the reorganization is complete and appropriate. Finding aids have been prepared, which sounds reasonable except that archival reorganizations don't typically prevent access to specific, already identified documents. They might delay access to entire collections while cataloging is being updated. But if a researcher knows exactly which document they want, and that document has a catalog number, as the October 11 meeting does in the administrative log, there's no technical reason why access couldn't be provided even during a reorganization. This suggests that the ongoing reorganization was being used as a convenient excuse to delay a decision the congregation didn't want to make. And when Gruters followed up in 2017, asking for a timeline for when the reorganization would be complete, he received no response at all, which is itself a kind of response, a signal that the institution considers the matter closed and isn't interested in further discussion. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the congregation's restrictions are specifically about protecting institutional reputation, trying to hide evidence of how theological conservatives tried to sabotage the council before it began, or whether the restrictions reflect a broader institutional culture that treats all internal deliberations as confidential by default and sees no reason to create exceptions just because scholars are curious, but the effect is the same either way. The historical record remains incomplete in ways that systematically favor institutional interests because the information we don't have access to is precisely the information that would allow us to evaluate how decisions were actually made, what alternatives were considered, and whether official explanations of events match what actually happened in private deliberations. You've followed this story now through layers of administrative procedure and archival restriction, and what you're starting to see is that the question of what happened in Sala Riunioni C on October 11, 1962 is actually inseparable from the larger question of how the Catholic Church manages its institutional memory of Vatican II, because the Council represents a genuine discontinuity in Catholic history, not theologically, because the Church can't admit theological discontinuity without undermining its claims to possess unchanging truth, but institutionally and culturally, a moment when the Church's self-understanding shifted from seeing itself as a fortress, defending eternal truths against modern era, to seeing itself as a pilgrim, people moving through history and needing to engage with rather than reject contemporary thought. And institutions don't handle discontinuity well, because discontinuity raises questions about whether the pre-discontinuity position was wrong, which in turn raises questions about institutional authority and whether that authority can be trusted now if it was wrong then. The sealing of Sala Riunioni C fits into a broader pattern of how the Vatican has managed access to Council-era materials, a pattern that becomes clear when you look at the timeline of archive openings. The archives of Pius XV, who died in 1958 before the Council, were opened in 2020 after decades of scholarly pressure, and they revealed extensive documentation of the Vatican's knowledge of and response to the Holocaust, material that was deeply uncomfortable for the Church but which was eventually released because the events were far enough in the past and enough scholarly work had already been done that the Vatican's version of events had been largely incorporated into the historical narrative, meaning that the archival opening didn't fundamentally challenge established interpretations. But the archives of Paul VI, who guided the Church through the Council's implementation from 1963 to 1978, remain substantially closed, except for selected materials that have been released in controlled ways through Vatican publications and carefully curated exhibitions. And there's no announced timeline for a general opening, even though Paul VI has been canonized as a saint, which you'd think would make the Vatican eager to provide access to documents that would show his leadership during the Church's most transformative period in centuries. The institutional mechanism here is what could be called strategic archival delay, where the institution acknowledges in principle that documents should eventually be made available, but implements that principle in ways that ensure current theological and political controversies are resolved before the historical evidence that might complicate those controversies becomes accessible to researchers, which means that by the time documents are opened, the debates they might have informed are already settled, and the documents function more as historical confirmation of already established narratives than as evidence that could challenge or revise those narratives. This is frustrating for historians, but it's rational from the institution's perspective, because it allows the Vatican to maintain control over how its history is understood, even while appearing to practice archival transparency. And it works because scholars and the public eventually lose interest in controversies from 50 or 60 years ago. So by the time documents are opened, nobody except specialist researchers cares enough to invest the time needed to work through the material and potentially discover evidence that contradicts official accounts. The real consequence of this approach is that we don't actually know in any detailed way what happened during the crucial negotiations and confrontations that shaped Vatican II, because the people who were there are almost all dead now. Karl Rahner died in 1984, Yves Congar in 1995. Cardinal Ottaviani in 1979, and their private papers and correspondence provide some insight but are necessarily incomplete because they don't include what was said in meetings, what deals were made or refused, what threats were issued or concessions granted in the closed-door sessions where the real work of the Council happened, as opposed to the public debates in St. Peter's Basilica that journalists covered. We have the Council's official documents, 16 texts including 4 constitutions, 9 decrees, and 3 declarations, and we have thousands of books and articles analyzing those texts, but we don't have reliable access to the process that produced them, which means we can't really evaluate questions like whether the final texts represent genuine consensus or carefully worded compromises that papered over unresolved disagreements. Whether the progressive theology that emerged from the Council was what the majority of bishops actually wanted, or whether it was imposed by theological experts who drafted the documents in language that most bishops didn't fully understand, whether figures like Ottaviani were simply defeated in open debate, or whether they made strategic retreats with promises that certain aspects of traditional theology would be protected even if the Council's language seemed to move in progressive directions. These aren't academic questions. They're questions about how the contemporary Catholic Church functions, because many of the internal conflicts that have characterized Catholicism since the Council, arguments about liturgy, about papal authority, about how doctrine develops, about the role of bishops versus the curia, trace back to different interpretations of what the Council actually decided. And those interpretations are shaped by incomplete historical knowledge that systematically favors the institutional narrative because the institution controls access to the evidence that might complicate that narrative. Now let me bring this back to the physical space of Sala Riunioni C, because the room itself has become in some ways a symbol of this larger dynamic of institutional control over historical memory. In 2018, according to a brief mention in the Italian newspaper Il Messaggero, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith underwent another round of renovations as part of maintenance work across Vatican buildings, and the construction permit filed with the Governatorato, Vatican City's civil administration, listed various spaces being updated. But Sala Riunioni C was specifically marked no access, maintenance deferred, meaning that even during a renovation project that required construction workers to access virtually every other room in the building, this one room remained off-limits. The construction supervisor, quoted anonymously in the Il Messaggero article, said that when his crew asked about accessing the room to check for structural issues, this was during a project that included checking all the building's plumbing and electrical systems. They were told by dicastery officials that the room had special historical significance and would be handled separately. And then it never was handled. The renovation was completed around the room, and it remains to this day in the same sealed status it's held since October 1962, now approaching 70 years of restriction with no official explanation beyond vague references to historical sensitivity and ongoing reviews that never conclude. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this is evidence of a conspiracy to hide something genuinely explosive, perhaps documents or recordings from the October 11th meeting that would reveal embarrassing details about how theological conservatives tried to manipulate the Council, or whether it's simply bureaucratic inertia combined with institutional culture that defaults to secrecy, where nobody wants to be the person who made the decision to unseal something that later turns out to have been better left sealed. So the default is always to maintain restrictions until someone with sufficient authority explicitly orders them lifted. And that authority never comes because nobody at a high enough level thinks this is important enough to spend political capital on when they have contemporary crises to manage. Either way, the outcome is the same. A physical space that's been removed from the institution's functional life, that exists in building plans but not in lived reality, that's referenced in documents but never explained, that serves as a kind of architectural monument to institutional opacity, and that will almost certainly remain sealed until everyone who remembers why it was sealed in the first place is dead. and the original reason no longer matters because the theological and political context that made it sensitive has been so completely transformed that whatever's in that room or not in that room can no longer affect contemporary debates about Catholic identity and authority. You've traveled with me now through 60 years of administrative decisions and archival gaps, through meeting logs and denied requests in a room that's been sealed since a single October night in 1962. And what you've discovered isn't a secret in the dramatic sense. There's no hidden document that would overturn Catholic theology, no conspiracy that reaches into contemporary Vatican politics, but something more subtle and perhaps more important, which is how institutions manage discomfort with their own history by controlling access to the evidence of that history until the discomfort has faded or the context has changed enough that the evidence no longer threatens institutional narratives. Sala Riunioni C remains sealed, not because what happened there was scandalous, but because it was emblematic of a moment when the Church's traditional structures for enforcing doctrinal conformity broke down, when theologians who had been censured and restricted suddenly became the architects of the Council's theological vision, when the Holy Office's authority to determine orthodoxy was challenged publicly and permanently, and the institution has never fully processed that transition or developed a narrative that accounts for how quickly and completely the pre-council order collapsed once the council began. The October 11 meeting, whatever specifically was discussed during those hours, represents that transitional moment in microcosm, Cardinal Ottaviani and his allies trying to negotiate limits on the theological transformation they could see coming, and Ronner and Congar either refusing those limits or provisionally accepting them before the council's opening made any pre-agreements obsolete. The real consequence of keeping this history sealed isn't that we don't understand Vatican II. We have extensive documentation of the Council itself, thousands of pages of debate transcripts and draft documents and bishops' interventions, and the theological literature on the Council is vast and sophisticated. What we don't understand is how the institutional church experienced the council, what it felt like for the bureaucrats and officials who had spent careers defending a particular vision of Catholicism, to watch that vision be dismantled over 3 years of debate, what strategies they used to protect what they could, what accommodations they made, what resistance they offered, and how they eventually came to terms, or didn't come to terms, with the new theological and institutional order that emerged. That human and institutional dimension of the Council is largely missing from the historical record, because it's precisely the dimension that documents like meeting minutes, internal memos, and private correspondence would illuminate. And those are exactly the materials that remain restricted or that were never preserved because someone decided that preserving them would create future problems for institutional reputation or theological coherence. The pattern you've seen tonight in the story of Sala Riunioni C, administrative decisions that look innocuous individually but that collectively create a system of opacity, archival gaps that might be accidental but that consistently favor institutional interests, restrictions that are justified in terms of ongoing review or historical sensitivity but that have no clear endpoint or criteria for being lifted. This pattern appears throughout the Vatican's archival system and throughout the archives of any institution that's been operating for centuries and that understands that controlling historical narrative is part of maintaining contemporary authority. It's not that these institutions are hiding scandals in every sealed file. It's that they've learned that some aspects of institutional life are better left unexamined. That transparency about internal divisions or strategic errors or moments when official positions were based on political calculations rather than principled convictions creates opportunities for critics and undermines the institution's claim to speak with moral authority. So the default is to restrict access until time has done its work of making controversial decisions seem inevitable or at least understandable in context, which usually takes longer than the institution would prefer, but which always eventually arrives because human memory is short and institutional memory is selective. The physical room, Sala Riunioni C on the third floor of the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, sits empty tonight as it has for decades, its windows facing north toward the Vatican gardens where tourists never go, its door locked with the special lock installed in October 1962, its administrative status still listed as uso special con autorizzazione in building records that are themselves restricted from public access. A space that exists in bureaucratic reality, but not in functional reality. That carries historical significance the institution acknowledges but won't explain, and that will likely remain sealed until some future Vatican administration decides that enough time has passed, enough theological controversies have been resolved or rendered obsolete, enough of the people involved have died and been canonized or forgotten, that the risk of opening the room and whatever documentation it might contain is smaller than the embarrassment of continuing to maintain such an obvious symbol of institutional secrecy. And maybe you're wondering, as you lie there listening to this, whether it really matters what happened in one room during one night 62 years ago, whether the theological debates of the 1960s have any relevance to contemporary Catholicism or to anyone outside the Church who's trying to understand how institutions operate. And I'd say it matters because the patterns established then continue now, because the same institutional instincts that led to sealing that room in 1962 lead to contemporary decisions about what information gets shared and what gets withheld, what documents get digitized and made widely available, and what documents remain accessible only to researchers willing to jump through elaborate bureaucratic hoops that ensure only the most persistent ever see them. And understanding those patterns is part of understanding how any large old institution manages the tension between its need to appear transparent and its fear of what transparency might reveal. The story of Sala Riunioni C isn't about what happened. It's about how not knowing what happened shapes everything that comes after, how gaps in the historical record aren't neutral absences but active presences that structure what questions can be asked and what answers seem plausible. How institutional control over archives is institutional control over memory, and how memory shapes identity in ways we're usually not conscious of until someone points out what's missing from the story we've been told. If you've stayed with me all the way through this, I'm grateful. These aren't easy stories to follow because they're about absence and procedure rather than dramatic revelation, but I think they matter. And if you found value in understanding how institutional silence works in practice, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video. Let the algorithm know this kind of detailed historical work deserves an audience. If you haven't subscribed to Tales of Vatican Secrets, now's a good time. New videos every day, different aspects of how the Vatican manages its history and its present, different windows into how institutions that claim eternal authority actually function year to year, decision by decision. I'll be back tomorrow night with something new, another corner of the archive, or another sealed door, or another gap in the record that tells us more than what's officially documented ever could. Rest easy, wherever you are.